Greetings. Welcome. Welcome to the third episode of my Substack and also YouTube podcast called The Ninth Wave. Those who have perhaps watched the first or the second episodes already know that my name is Tariq Cyril Amar. I'm a historian by training, and I have turned myself into a commentator on geopolitics, politics, and in general, as I think, precarious state the world is in now, which is why I've called my podcast The Ninth Wave. Without further ado, the occasion, I should perhaps say, for today's episode is that yesterday a very important vote took place in the United States and Washington in the House of Representatives. And the essence of this vote, although it's, of course, as always, a complicated story involving a lot of domestic American politics with a lot of mutual recriminations and intriguing and all those things that are always in the mix there. But the essence of the story is not that complicated. This is a bill, a law, right, in the making that foresees massive funding, another bout of massive funding, above all to Ukraine, but also to a significant extent to Israel, and to a much smaller extent, but it's significant nevertheless, I think, to Taiwan and other so-called allies, or I would say clients of the United States in the Asia-Pacific region. It is perfectly clear that in one way or the other, this was an important event, and it will have consequences in the near future and perhaps even in the slightly farther away future that will matter a lot. I doubt, and I will talk about this much more later, that the consequences of this enormous shot in the arm, right, of billions and billions, I'll talk about the details too, will be that those who have now passed this legislation expect. I think this will not work as intended, and we will get into that in a few moments. Let me first of all explain how I would like to talk about this today, to keep it reasonably short and concise. I'd like to say a few words about the funding that is going specifically to Israel. But that will not be my main topic, not today. My main topic today will actually be the funding that is now earmarked once again for Ukraine. I repeat, we have an overall volume of $95 billion. Of that, 60.84 billion are earmarked for Ukraine, and about 26, a little bit over 26 billion are earmarked for Israel. So first, let's talk a little bit about the money that is meant to go to Israel, and then about the money that is supposed to in some way help Ukraine. I think it will do the opposite, but we get to that. So I think the most important thing about the additional financial and military aid, most of it is really geared toward military purposes, that the United States is extending once again to Israel. The most important and the most scandalous thing about this is, of course, that Israel is in the process of committing the crime of genocide against the Palestinians in Gaza. It is certainly also in the process of committing various other crimes against humanity, war crimes, not only in Gaza, but also intensively, at least on the West Bank. This, apart from the fact that Israel habitually launches perfectly illegal aggressions against its neighbors, faraway neighbors included, such as Iran, that endangers the whole region with a horrible escalation into a major war, a much bigger war than even now, right? And that at the same time could also actually trigger something even worse, namely a global war. Now, the response in the United States to this type of behavior is to send them more money, right? This is nothing new. This is the insanely symbiotic special relationship that the American establishment is having with Israel. It's perverse. It runs counter to fundamental ethics. It runs counter to international law. And actually, it also runs counter to the national interests of the United States if its elite really looked after the national interests of the United States first. Um, Israel, it is important to remember in this context, has not stopped its genocidal massacres in Gaza. We've had several over the last days, right? And it has also by no means agreed to a ceasefire. It is quite the opposite. Israel is not agreeing to a ceasefire, and it is constantly threatening in very concrete ways to launch another major operation into the city and the area of Rafah, which is, of course, where it has already corralled, is really the word, more than 1 million Palestinians who live under horrible circumstances, very often including literal starvation, as has been confirmed by the UN and the World Food Programme. With all of this, the response from the United States is to, as they say in international politics, reward this behavior with even more money. There's one wrinkle here, which is that a certain amount of this money is officially earmarked as for humanitarian aid. Now, I have two comments on that, and I won't really spend a lot of time on this because it's not worth the time, this type of primitive lying and spinning. One is that the United States is still not funding UNRWA, which is, of course, the platform that you should be funding, the organization that you should be funding if you were in any way serious about actually helping the Palestinians with humanitarian aid. In fact, even in this legislation, UNRWA has once again been excluded. And the second point is a bit more general. It is that in the case of the United States, providing what they call humanitarian aid is, of course, a transparent pretext, a transparent double game. It has to do with electoral politics at home, in which the United States tries to sort of camouflage its brutal, massive complicity in the Israeli genocide by then offering a little bit of humanitarian aid. This cannot be taken seriously, and it won't surprise you that, for instance, the Palestinian Authority, think of it what you will, the Palestinian Authority has been very clear about it. They have called the passing of this aid, the passing of the aid itself, right, by the Americans, by the House of Representatives, an aggression against the Palestinian people, and I think they're absolutely right about this. So much about this. There are other aspects of this whole complicated package of laws which have all been set apart but also bundled together. It's a complicated process. It doesn't have to detain us here. So much about this Israeli aspect. There's also another drive against China in the form of another assault on TikTok. I think I'll talk about this separately. And then there is something called the Repo Act, which gets us closer to our topic, namely the funding for Ukraine. When the United States is sending funding into Ukraine or for Ukraine, what it is really doing is, of course, it's funding its own proxy war against Russia, right? That's the geopolitical reality here. And in that sense, the Repo Act is part of the same strategy. The Repo Act has one very, very simple idea. It will allow the American government to seize Russian sovereign assets that belong to the Russian state, right, that are in American banks. Now, these assets were frozen already in 2022, of course, but they were not seized. And there are very, very good reasons why they were not seized. As we know from history, seizing the sovereign assets of another government is highly unusual, right? It does sometimes occur, but it is very unusual. Seizing the sovereign assets of a government you're not even formally at war with, and the US is not formally at war with Russia, right, is even more bizarre, right? And ultimately, and I will keep this very short, it is also to an extent a symbolical gesture because the total volume of Russian sovereign assets frozen in the West as a whole in 2022 is more or less $300 billion. That's a lot. But only 6 billion, more or less 6 billion of those 300 billion are actually in American banks. Most of these frozen assets are in various European banks, right? And of course, there is a discussion in Europe as well about them. Let's not go into this now. So the Repo Act that facilitates, that allows the American government to, I would argue, illegally seize these assets, not just freeze them, but take them and reappropriate them for different purposes. This Repo Act is really only about a relatively small share of the overall frozen Russian assets in the West. It is, of course, also meant to be a precedent. It is a way in which the United States, as always, is trying to twist the arms of all its so-called allies, that is, its clients and vassals in Europe and in the G7, because there discussions about what to do about the vast remainder of Russian frozen assets are ongoing. And what the United States is doing here, I think it is trying to set an example of embarking on the most extreme and most destructive, and I think also self-harming course possible. Why is it self-harming? It is self-harming because it will certainly, and some American observers have, of course, talked about this as well, for instance, in an op-ed in the New York Times a week or so ago. If the United States actually seizes Russian sovereign assets, money that belongs to the Russian state, it sends a very strong signal that it is not at all reliable as the controller of the reserve currency of the world, the dollar. And what this all boils down to in the end, this can of course get very complex, but I think the upshot is simple. By doing something like this, the Americans are in essence promoting de-dollarization, the turn away from the dollar, because so many states in the world and so many governments in the world have by now understood that the United States accepts no limits anymore on using the dollar as a weapon, right? That in itself, a turn away from the dollar, if it becomes a large phenomenon, it isn't that yet, but it can very well become that, would be catastrophic for America and for American power. America is only capable of being in debt the way it is, I think right now to the tune of $34 trillion, right? A trillion is 1,000 billions, just to put this in context, with those 300 billions of Russian frozen assets we are talking about. The United States can really only have this $34 trillion debt because of the dollar's very special position as the world's most important by far reserve currency and also its major trading currency. Both these things are massively endangered by stunts like this. The United States elite shows a striking lack of foresight here, but that's nothing new. Now, let's talk a little bit about the bill that is supposed to support Ukraine, right? As I've already said, it's basically $61 billion. That's a lot. It also comes after a very long delay and struggle, where in essence a powerful faction of the Republicans in the United States refused to go along with this outside funding of Ukraine anymore. In particular, they tried to tie this issue to what they think of as the problem of border security. Now, all of this has fallen aside, right? This particular quid pro quo has been given up. This is basically due to the actions of the Republican Speaker of the House, a man called Mike Johnson, as you probably know, who has, in essence, sided with the Democrats and the Biden administration on this issue and used a number of creative maneuvers to finally get those laws through. Right? What this means for American domestic politics, we will want to talk about as well. I don't want to make that the first thing we talk about. I would like to begin by one simple fact. Even the Prime Minister of Ukraine, a man called Denis Shmyhal, has actually acknowledged 2 weeks ago publicly that Of those $61 billion that the US has now finally assigned to support for Ukraine, 50 would be spent and will be spent inside the US on American makers of arms and ammunitions. Well, this is not surprising, right? What has happened here is, in essence, a proxy war has been used to release an enormous bounty to the military industrial complex, in particular the industrial side of the military industrial complex. This is by no means surprising, but I think it needs restating. This is very clear. The most misleading idea you could have about what happens with this money is that it's somehow taken and sent to Ukraine. This is not how this works. And the second most misleading idea you could have is that this money magically, immediately translates into an appropriate amount of weapons. It's mostly about weapons, right? I'm leaving out a few wrinkles here. Into an appropriate amount of weapons, artillery shells, munitions for air defense systems, and so on and so on, all those things that are currently under discussion, and they then go to Ukraine. Nothing of the sort is going to happen. There are certain amounts, and they're small, they're relatively small, of ammunition and weapons that can be released by the Pentagon, partly in storage already in Europe, partly in Poland. There are certain small amounts that can be released quickly. That is true, right? But those are small amounts. They are in no proportion to that figure of $61 billion. That is a much more complex question. Now, I would like to ask two or three main questions about this whole project, right? This funding package for Ukraine, right? What is the purpose, according to the people who do it, right? Secondly, what is its real function? Because that's definitely different. It's not what the people who do it are telling you. And thirdly, what is it actually going to do, or what is it likely to do in the future, right? So let's begin with what is the official purpose? What are those who have now brought this through the House of Representatives, and it will go on from there, it will succeed from there, right, to the Senate and then the signature of the president. What are those who have driven this, who want this? What are they telling us this is about and this is supposed to do? Now let's begin with a quote by that Mike Johnson, who is, again, the House Speaker, a Republican, and I would say at this point the crucial figure in actually making this work or having made this work. What has he told us? Right? Let's have a quote from him. Here's one. My son is going to begin at the Naval Academy this fall. Good for him. This is a live fire exercise for me. Interesting shift. As it is for so many American families. Why is aid to Ukraine a live fire exercise to these families? Anyhow, he will tell us. This is not a game. It is not a joke, right? And then he tells us, to put it bluntly, says Mike Johnson, I'd rather send bullets to Ukraine than American boys. It is perfectly fair to translate this statement into, I'd rather have Ukrainian boys die than American boys. This is what this is really about, right? Please hold on to that thought. We come back to it, right? He has not said it in quite these words, but it was actually, I think, clear enough for everyone to hear. But there is another nuance here that really struck me when I read that particular statement. I'd rather send bullets to Ukraine than American boys. Isn't the official position of the Biden administration that it is not planning to send American troops to Ukraine? That is the official position. So why is the Speaker of the House, who has been briefed, right, in special confidential briefings, of course, why is he implying that the alternative to passing this bill, to getting this funding rolling, is to send American boys? What does he mean by that, right? So this is very speculative, but I'm almost tempted to think that someone in these confidential briefings has scared Mike Johnson by saying the following. Look, Our official position is that we are not sending our ground troops or other troops, at least not in large numbers, right, to Ukraine. But if Ukraine really is on the verge of defeat, then maybe that will change. Maybe this is what Johnson has been told. If he has been told that, it need not be the truth. It can be something that he has been told to impress him. That is not at all what the administration really plans to do. That is true. However, please pay attention to this curious phrase that he has released there, right? Now, another phrase he used was that, I will give you the whole quote again. Here's Mike Johnson, Speaker of the House, once again. I really believe the intel and the briefings that we've gotten. I believe that Xi Jinping, of course, President of China, and Vladimir Putin and Iran, it's funny, with Iran, he can't remember the name of the president, it's just Iran, and Iran really are an axis of evil. I think they are in coordination. I think that Vladimir Putin would continue to march through Europe. My God, what a mess. Let's begin at the end. Now, there isn't the slightest sign that Vladimir Putin or the Russians as a whole, the Russian state, have any plans to march through Europe. Absolutely not. It doesn't get more true by repeating it. It's nonsense. It's nonsense. It's a Western fantasy, right? It, of course, also, and this has been pointed out many times, doesn't sync at all with the other very frequently used Western argument, which is that Ukraine must get into NATO because if it had been in NATO, then Putin would never have dared attack. You understand the inconsistency immediately. Of course, it has just been pointed out by the Russian foreign minister too, which is, well, if your argument is that states that are in NATO do not get attacked by Russia, then you cannot at the same time say that Russia plans to attack a lot of NATO states once they win in Ukraine. Now, these two things are completely incommensurate. They're completely inconsistent, I should say. They don't work at all together. It's sheer absurdity, right? That's one thing. We've seen this a lot, right? The other thing is axis of evil. Again, I'm not the first one pointing this out. But the last time an American president, in fact, right, George Bush II, George W. Bush, George Bush I don't even know what to call him. The last time an American president used that phrase, it ended up in a number of catastrophic wars in the Middle East. There's no other way of putting it, right? So when somebody in America starts talking about axis of evil, it's not only completely unrealistic, of course, and very offensive, but let that pass, right? They're not only showing me that they are without limits in terms of ideological stubbornness and obstinacy and ideological derangement, really. It's just a very unrealistic phrase. It has nothing to do with the real world. They are also showing me that they have learned nothing from not even history, right? This is so recent. I hesitate to call it history. They have learned nothing from the very recent record of massive American cluster Fs. Nothing. This phrase, axis of evil, should be toxic in American political discourse. And that it isn't toxic tells you a lot about American political discourse, right? And then there's something else, right? He says he believes that Iran, Russia, and China are in coordination. That's his phrase, right? So what? What does America really expect? That America talks to other states, but other states have no right to talk to each other? Of course they're in coordination. You make them coordinate, right? America is essentially, this is really basic IR, right? America is essentially making so many enemies and threatening so many other states that those other states would be very strange states if they didn't start talk to each other about how to push back, resist America. That's the most natural thing in the world. To turn the fact that they're talking to each other, that they are in coordination, into a reason to call them an axis of evil, and to pretend that one of them has enormous conquest plans in Europe that Russia simply doesn't have is again perfectly absurd. I have to say, this is the American elite speaking. And more, and I know I'm not the only one, but when I listen to them, I really begin to feel they are deranged. It is not that they have different opinions. It's not even that they're neocons. That's bad enough, right? It's that they seem to have lost contact with reality to an extent that is clinical, I have to say, right? So let's see what else he had to tell us. Um, he also, of course, and this is the last point about Johnson's statements I will make, repeated the word believe. I believe the intel. I believe the briefings. I believe this. I believe that. That tells me two things, which I find really intriguing. First of all, the Speaker of the House of Representatives finds it something he has to underline, that he actually believes the intelligence he is offered by other government agencies. And to be honest, I would understand that. I think it is very hard to believe a lot of what American government agencies produce. And he makes a point of telling you, I believe, I believe, I believe. And the second thing, of course, that it also makes me think of is that the same person, Mike Johnson again, also then went public and said, look, essentially, we as Christians, or those of us who are Christians, right, we also have to support Israel because Israel has a special place de facto in the Bible, right? If this happened in any other state, if this argument would be advanced by a high public official, by an important politician, about how a major foreign policy decision has been reached and how very large amounts of money are being spent, we would, of course, say that this actually is very odd. Belief of that sort should not play a role like that in modern politics, right? It is almost a bit of a theocratic accent in there. And the funny thing, of course, is that it's sort of a vicarious theocratic accident on behalf of Israel, right? Israel, as Ilan Pappé, the critical Israeli historian, joked a long time ago, Zionists usually don't believe in God, but they all believe that God promised them this land, right? It is sort of connecting to that perverse logic, right, that Israel itself is using. And here I will stop laughing because that perverse logic, as we very well know, ends up with ethnic cleansing and genocide. A logic that says, I have an old book, that is what this really is, and in that old book there is a story, and the story says that this place belongs to me, even if you live here. So go away or I will kill you, right? This is the essence of that logic. And like others in the United States, the Speaker of the House of Representatives has actually once again publicly endorsed that logic on his own. He also has invoked religion, in particular Christianity, in a way that is politicized and serves, and this is even worse than politicization, serves the politics of land stealing, ethnic cleansing, genocide, and apartheid. I tell you one thing again, I've mentioned it before, I'm a lapsed Roman Catholic, right? But you never really stop. As the Russians say about secret agents, there are no formers. I tell you a secret, it's the same for Roman Catholics, there are no formers. So as a Roman Catholic, as much as I am one, and therefore also a Christian, I really take offense. My religion, my Christianity, and I think I'm right on this, has nothing to do with providing justification, or I should say pseudo justification, for genocide. Absolutely nothing. I think it's actually blasphemous in religious terms to invoke religion, specifically Christian religion, to justify such horrific crimes committed, after all, against what a Christian should recognize as God's children, right? So, okay, that's Johnson. Now, let us ask, what is this supposed to do? apart from keeping the American boys out of Ukraine and letting the Ukrainian boys die instead. What is this supposed to do? We really have to ask here. The idea that this is supposed to keep Putin from marching through Europe is bogus. This is nonsense. That's not even an option, right? What else is it supposed to do? Is it supposed to help Ukraine win the war on the terms of the current Ukrainian government? Then let me remind you that those terms include recapturing all territory currently under Russian control as it was in 1991, reconstituting the Ukrainian map as it was in 1991. That's the official Ukrainian war aims still. They make no sense. They don't align with reality on the battlefield at all, but those are the official war aims. So if the aim of this support of these $61 billion is to help Ukraine chase this insane dream any further, then we can immediately say that it will be completely futile. In those terms, this is money wasted, to put it very simply, because that is an impossible thing. It will not happen anymore. Now, what could be another aim? Could another aim be to somehow strengthen the Ukrainians so much that they can resist the Russians enough so that the Russians somehow still have to come to a compromise settlement that is reasonably acceptable to Ukraine? That could be the aim, right? Now, there are two problems with this, and they're very severe. One is this move is happening exactly at the time when Putin himself and other Russian officials have signaled once again that they are actually open to negotiations. I know the Western media don't talk much about this, but it's true. They have signaled once again and repeatedly that Russia is open to a negotiated end of the war. But at the same time, they have made it very, very clear that they expect that the negotiations would take place on the basis on reality as it is now. In other words, what Russia is saying, we are ready to negotiate, but only if the other side, that is Ukraine and de facto the West, accept all the advances, or at least most of those, that we have already made. Russia is saying we are ready to negotiate, in other words, but we are not ready to pretend that we are actually losing the war, right? Because the reality is that as a minimum, you have to recognize that Russia has the upper hand now, very much. And I would actually argue that Russia is already winning, right? So Russia is open to negotiations, but on the basis of that reality. That may be tough for Ukraine, but it is still a possibility to find a compromise and negotiate. One has to say that if Ukraine wanted a better compromise, that was available in the spring of 2022, of course, right? In the talks that reached their final stage in Istanbul. And the reason why that compromise that was almost finished and that was very advantageous to Ukraine, why that compromise did not actually come into being, the reason why the war did not end in spring 2022 is that Ukraine said no. And the reason that Ukraine said no was not Bucha. Don't believe that legend, whoever exactly did that. The reason was that the West, especially in the shape of Boris Johnson, then Prime Minister of the UK, directly told Zelensky, the leader of Ukraine, don't go for the deal. We give you everything you need. You can do better. You can win. That was an empty and insane promise that Zelensky, as a responsible statesman, as somebody who had to take care of Ukraine most of all, should never have accepted. Right? Any compromise now is not going to be as favorable to Ukraine. But nevertheless, it is interesting to see that when Russia is signaling we can talk, if on the basis of reality, right? The answer from the US is we are releasing much more money to Ukraine again so they can fight you more, right? So there may be people in the West who fantasize that the final outcome of this will be that therefore Ukraine can sort of stave off the Russians and then it can negotiate, but from a different and better position. I am sorry to inform you that the opposite will happen. Because it's so transparent, among other things, the Russians will make a point of destroying whatever the Ukrainians bring into play in addition to what they have now. Keep in mind that the Europeans, essentially the Europeans and the Americans, give and take Japan, Canada, and other states like that, but keep in mind that the collective West has already spent, before the 61 billion, about 250 billion on helping Ukraine, before these 61. And where have they got us? They have got us exactly where we are now, namely to a situation in which Russia is actually winning. So what makes these people think that the next 61 billions will turn the tide? No, they will be absorbed in exactly the same way. And Russia, looking ahead to the future, to maintaining its deterrent potential, will make a point of not letting these $61 billion count. They will see to that, right? Now, you can put this also in the context of a recent quote by the NATO commander in Europe, the supreme allied commander of NATO in Europe, the American General Christopher Cavoli. And what he has recently acknowledged is, and I'm quoting again, Russia is reconstituting its military force far faster than our initial estimates suggested. And he means estimates made in 2022 here. The Russian army is now 15% larger than in February 22, which is, of course, the month in which this massive war erupted that we have now. The Russian army is 15% larger, not smaller, not degraded. Of course, they have had losses, of course, and they might be quite big. But the point is that they're perfectly capable of replacing them, that the morale of the Russian army has improved, if anything. It certainly hasn't broken, as a lot of people expected and predicted in 2022. And the Russian military-industrial complex has also only grown. And on top of that, as we all know, Russia has managed to build, as it were, a network of states which support it and not the West. Most prominently China, but not only China. North Korea is part of it. Iran is part of it in its way, and so on. So the whole idea that by pumping money into Ukraine and making Ukrainians die in the hundreds of thousands in a proxy war, at least you would in the end weaken Russia. That whole idea has already been shown not only to be morally extremely wrong, it has also been shown not to work. This is for the cynics among us, the pragmatists who don't want to acknowledge that morality should play a role. I think it should, right? But if you want to be cynical, right, and you want to think only in effects of power, right, gains and losses, the wins and the losses, as we now say, the West has not gained by the policy of pumping money into Ukraine in exchange for very many dead Ukrainians. In fact, Russia has only grown stronger, right? This is a lesson we've already learned. So then there's a question, why are the Americans throwing another 61 billion into this? David Saxs, a commentator, sometimes very smart, on geopolitics and other issues, has gone on X and surmised that this is the beginning of another forever war. This is only another milestone, and in a year they'll do it again, and then again, and then again. And so it's going to be this war that drags on forever, right? I think he's wrong here. And I can tell you exactly why. One reason is, I think there's a very real possibility that this money is not supposed to be repeated at all, not even in America. That the reason why it was released, the deepest reason is that it's a final gift to Ukraine so that both sides, the Republicans and the Democrats, the administration, and of course Donald Trump, can wash their hands of Ukraine. And I think that the release of this money is actually a sign that they all believe that Ukraine is very close to defeat. So for Trump, who for a long time opposed this funding, it made sense to sort of declare himself neutral and step aside, which is what he did, right? Because he is in an election campaign and he is not keen to see Ukraine lose, say, in the next 3 months, maybe in a major offensive in the summer by the Russians, who knows, speculative. And then he would be blamed as you lost Ukraine because your interference through your Republican loyalists in Congress ultimately led to the fact that we couldn't give them enough money, and because we couldn't give them enough money, they lost. Right? That argument would be bogus, it would be nonsense, but it would certainly be made. So for Trump, it made a lot of electoral, tactical sense to not die on this hill, which is precisely the position he has taken. For Biden, on the other hand, it is important to try to maintain Ukraine at least not officially defeated, until the election in November. Because obviously, as the incumbent, he doesn't want to have a situation in which Ukrainian defeat becomes official, let's say in June or September, which is right in his election campaign as well. And he would then be the president who lost Ukraine, right? So I don't think that this money was meant as another stage in an ongoing change of eternal funding. I don't think this is the case here. The other reason is, of course, that as Clausewitz taught us, the famous Prussian German military theorist who everybody quotes and nobody reads, right? I have. Clausewitz has taught us one very simple thing that a lot of people forget in the West now, which is when you have plans in war, it's complicated because your enemy also has plans, right? And the enemy in this case, or the opponent, if you want a more neutral term of the West, is of course Russia. Russia will not allow forever war. One reason is that Russia's resources as well are limited. I have just explained what many people have observed, that Russia is actually doing very well in terms of military mobilization and economic mobilization. That's all true. But that doesn't mean it has unlimited resources. In fact, you can make an argument that for demographic reasons, which have to do with the availability of manpower, literally the availability of young men willing to serve, or perhaps to available for being recruited, that for demographic reasons, Russia as well is on a timer. Emmanuel Todd, the famous French intellectual, has made precisely that argument recently in his recent book on, essentially, I don't know the defeat of the West. I think it's the English title. I've read it in French. He's made exactly that argument, that yes, Russia is much stronger than people in the West want to acknowledge, but there is a demographic limit to Russian power. And it is actually quite close. It has an effect probably already on the way that the Russian leadership thinks even about this war. So on one side, it is true, as many people have observed, that for Russia, the strategy of, as it were, slow grind, of what they often call the active defense, right, of not trying what is called big arrow warfare, right, these smashing offensives right across the map. That strategy makes sense, and it has given them everything that has succeeded in this war from them up until now, right? They arguably tried a sort of big arrow thing at the very beginning, although it's tricky because they didn't use enough troops and so on. So it's a hybrid, what happened there. And that didn't go well. And since they switched to this strategy, to this posture really of active defense, they've done very well, right? So a lot of observers rightly argue, I think, that for the Russian leadership and the Russian military, it's not so obvious that they have to launch large offensives. They may, but they also have a winning method already in place. However, keep in mind that whatever method they choose, the Russians too are sitting on a timer. They too have limits on their resources. And I'm stressing that because I really don't think this will be a forever war. For one very simple reason, at least, the Russians won't let that happen. They will close this war. They will end this war, and most likely on their terms. So those were my main comments on this, this particular bill and what has happened here. It will not function the way it is supposed to function. It will not save Ukraine. It will lead, and the Russians have said this too, and I agree with them here. I think they're simply saying what is real in this case. It will lead to more dead Ukrainians, thousands of them at least, and in the end, it won't change the outcome of the war. Now, there is one last thing I would like to share with you, which is another quote from the Financial Times. And this is from an article that came out before this vote. And it said, the biggest short-term effect of this additional funding may be to boost Ukrainian morale, right? Kiev badly needs to raise more men. Oh, interesting. For its army. So having ammunition to fire back at the Russians will help. Yes, it's true. Soldiers with ammunitions are usually a little less demoralized than soldiers without. But, that is not such a brilliant point, to be honest. That's a very low bar. But what I would like to stress here is that this struck me as an extremely cynical comment. And for the following reasons. Ukraine has just passed a new mobilization law, which is highly unpopular because the people to be mobilized, usually men, are of course realizing that the war is being lost and that they're being thrown into a meat grinder without a decent chance of success, and that their life and their limbs and their future is being risked for what is a lost cause. And what this quote essentially says is, well, look, if we pass this money, at least it will have a psychological effect, and it will be easier for the Ukrainian government to draw on these additional soldiers. I think it is obvious why that is a dastardly argument, right? It is basically saying, well, you know what? The most important thing here is to help the regime mobilize people for a hopeless war. That's all I had to say for today. I'm sure I haven't touched on all the points that could be raised here. There are many more, but I hope it was to some extent informative and useful. And see you again another time. Thank you very much. Bye bye.